magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld, Eldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about hopes and dreams for the 10th edition Aeldari Codex. Now, we don't know when this is being released. I think probably not in 2024, but just by virtue of how far we are into the edition, it can't be too far away. And I want to be clear before I start that I don't have any insider information from Games Workshop. Everything I'm going to say is pure like hopes, dreams, and conjecture, and it's completely self-indulgent. I allow myself 2 or 3 pretty self-indulgent videos a year, and what I'm hoping to see in the Codex is one that I do in each edition. So I'm doing that now. For those of you who are not aware because you're new to the edition or new to 40K, we have currently rules for each faction in the game, factions that don't have codexes, right? They have special rules for a single type of detachment, which gives them some sort of broad detachment bonus, plus usually 6 stratagems and 6 relics. I'm sorry, 4 relics. Relics are special items or abilities that you can give to characters. So generally speaking, for every faction, you have your broad faction bonus, right? So for Aeldari, it's fate dice, and then you get some other bonus and then access to 10 things, 6 stratagems and 4 relics for that detachment. And usually, most codexes that have come out have introduced a 6 detachment spread. So you have 6 different ways to play your faction. Maybe not all of these are equally competitive, but usually several are. And part of the fun of playing 40K is the versatility available to you, not only in the units that you choose to put into your army list, but in the overall strategy that you might construct around the bonuses available to those units. Now, theoretically, this is also a very cool opportunity for the 40K fluff to overlap with the 40K rules. So, for example, there are 5 major Aeldari craft worlds, and even though as a whole, Aeldari, right, have a vibe and a play style. They're supposed to have the most advanced tech in the galaxy and to be sort of elegant and aesthete, so very powerful and hard-hitting, but maybe not terribly durable and sort of quick and tricky. But then within that broad archetype, you have these sub-archetypes associated with each of the major craft worlds. So Ulthwe are all about powerful psychers and guardians, and Biel-Tan is all about aggression and aspect warriors, and Saim-Hann is the jet bike craft world, and Iyanden is the wraith construct craft world, and Alaitoc is the sneaky duck and cover shooty ranger craft world. And then we also have, of course, Ynnari and Harlequins. And ideally, the rules for each of these would not only be balanced and interesting and fun on the table, but also plausibly express the aesthetic identity of that craft world through the play style. So currently we have 1 set of rules, the Warhost rules, and what I'm going to do in this video is suggest and imagine some options as this 1 set of rules becomes, I hope, 7 sets of rules. I'd love to see a detachment for each of the major craft worlds, plus 1 for Harlequins, plus 1 for Ynnari. I could also imagine Harlequins or Ynnari getting their own supplement. I think it would make sense to just do it all in 1 book. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take you through my ideas for each of these, and I will mark in the time signature for the video where each of these starts in case you're only interested in 1 or 2. And in the incredibly unlikely chance that somebody from GW is listening to this, and there's still time to make changes to the Codex, and my childhood fantasy has come through and you want me to sign an NDA, I'll do that faster than you can say Ranadandra. But I don't think that's what's going on here. This is just a fun way to do something with some shower thoughts that I have frequently. So here we go. Okay, let's dive into hopes and dreams with Craft World Biel-Tan. And the reason that I'm starting with Biel-Tan is that this is where I see the current Warhost detachment migrating. That is the default index option, but with a couple of rather significant changes. So far, all of the codexes that have come out have included whatever the default index detachment was in some form, usually relatively unchanged, often completely unchanged. In this case, I think a few changes are necessary. So what is archetypally Biel-Tan-y about Biel-Tan? For those of you who don't know, Biel-Tan is the craft world that has the most aspect warriors, the more so than anywhere else. Space elves living on Biel-Tan feel the call of Cain and take up the path of the warrior, and culturally they are obsessed with restoring the old Aeldari Empire, which is bold indeed. Merely surviving at all would constitute a major victory for the species in decline. And the Biel-Tan-y are not happy to simply survive. They want to, or even thrive, they want to see space elves dominate the galaxy once again, as they did before the fall and the creation of Slaanesh, which makes them the most intolerant and perhaps the most aggressive craft world. So obviously, I think Biel-Tan-y rules should in some way incentivize running more aspect warriors. They should reward aspect warriors, but also in some sense, this playstyle might be the most generic playstyle for space elves, which is why I think it makes sense to migrate over with the Warhost detachment. That said, I think the Warhost detachment needs to change. And this is one place in the video where I know that I am going to earn the ire of a few of you by suggesting, maybe many of you, by suggesting that I actually think that the Warhost detachment needs to be reined in, not because there's anything wrong with the Aeldari win rate. We currently have around a 50% win rate, so it works, but for other reasons. I think there are two reasons why the current detachment ability it's too much. It's not, it doesn't do what a good attachment ability ought to do, which is bring the fluff to the table in a tactically interesting way. So currently the bonus for the Warhost detachment is every time you shoot or fight with any unit, you get to reroll one hit roll and one wound roll. That's extremely powerful, especially when you're dealing with weapons that have a low rate of fire but very high damage output. So sometimes with weapons like D cannons, or even individual Wraith cannons, not that those are as much of a thing anymore. On the Wraith Knight, the big Wraith cannons. Bright Lances on Warwalkers or on Vipers, Void Weavers, like all this stuff becomes significantly more effective. In some cases, it increases its damage output by 50%, which is crazy. And what this means is that in the early months of the edition, aside from just reining in how fate dice work and how devastating wounds work, which had Wraith Knights out of control, many of our low volume of fire units, like Warwalkers, like D cannons, like Void Weavers, saw relatively significant points increases, like often very significant points increases, to account for the fact that they were just much, much more lethal than they would be if they weren't, in some cases, rerolling literally all of their dice to hit and wound. And frankly, I think it's just not possible to have these units balanced for any other detachment when they have to be pointed to not be game-breaking for the Warhost detachment. So here's the change that I would like to see. I think the Warhost detachment should be you can reroll one die to hit, and aspect warriors can reroll one die to wound. Now, I understand that is a significant come down, but remember, I am imagining that this will come with points decreases on a number of those units that got big hikes in the first few months of the index. So, your D cannons and your Warwalkers and your whatevers don't hit quite as hard, but you can have more of them if you're running Biel-Tan. Now, my other reason for thinking that this change is really important, aside from the fact that you want these vehicle units to be viable in other detachments, is that I don't think that the play style that this rewards is particularly flavorful for Aeldari. I mean, it is narratively sensible for the faction that is supposed to have the most advanced tech in the game, arguably, to have weapons that are just much better at hitting and wounding. Like, that makes sense. But also, tactically speaking, that kind of bonus is a blunt instrument without nuance. And Aeldari have always been a high skill cap army that wins games with an overlapping symphony of clever synergies and buffs and clever positioning and play, and just like a flat 50% increase in damage output on high damage, low rate of fire weapons that you don't have to think about at all is not that. It's just a blunt instrument. And it was ported over from the Psychic Awakening rules at the end of 8th edition, when Aeldari were serious contenders for the worst faction in the game. For 2 years, they were, people forget this, right? People love to complain about Space Elves, but for 2 years of 40K, Aeldari were laughably awful. Nobody was bringing them to any major tournaments except for a small handful of people, and they were not winning. I mean, they were just completely terrible. At the beginning of 8th edition, there was a way to win with 27 Dark Reapers in a Ynnari list, and then there was a way to win for a while if you just ran 9 planes. But, I mean, the faction was tragically underpowered. And so near the end of the edition and into the beginning of 9th edition, they threw us this bone where you could choose 2 bonuses. Every faction had access to, like, custom sub-factions, right? And you could choose 2 bonuses, and what everybody was picking was this combination of bonuses that let you reroll 1 hit die and 1 die to wound. And so, you know, there's precedent for this, and Aeldari players really liked it. But the reason GW did this was as a temporary Band-Aid on a bigger problem, which was that the whole codex needed to be rewritten. And now that it's been rewritten, this is just not this rule is not, it's not consistent with the Aeldari playstyle. Space Elf players should need to win by being clever, not by just including more, you know, D cannons in their list or whatever. Okay, that said, I think that Craft World Biel-Tan is entitled to a little more flavor, Biel-Tan-y flavor, than I think is provided by the Warhost detachment, even if only Aspect Warriors hold on to the reroll, the 1 reroll to wound. So I would love to see one of the stratagems swapped out. I would pull out Phantasm, because Phantasm could go elsewhere, and Fire and Fade would remain. So we'd still have an elf trickery stratagem. I would replace it with a stratagem that let a unit of Aspect Warriors, either in the shooting or the fight phase, choose to either have critical hits or critical wounds on a 5-up, which would have amazing synergy with Hawk's lethal hits, or with Scorpions with their Manda Blasters with devastating wounds, or Dire Avengers with their, right? Like, most Aspect Warriors would have an opportunity to benefit from this in some way. It would also make Blade Storm a much better stratagem if you could trigger that on 5-up. Obviously, it wouldn't work for every Aspect Shrine. It wouldn't help Spiders out. Oh no, it would, because they have dev wounds too. I just think that this would be a great way to make Aspect Warriors a bit more dangerous, and have a CP tax on them doing that. I also wouldn't mind seeing one of the relics replaced with some obviously aggressive weapon. You know, I want to feel like, if I'm running Biel-Tan, I want to feel like my Imperialist elves are aggressively purging the Monkai. And so I would love to see like a cool relic sword or glaive, something that really did some serious damage, really ramped up the damage output, perhaps even on something like a Farseer Skyrunner or something. Or maybe, you know, it would create a reason to have a Autarch Skyrunner. Who knows? But something aggressive, and I think Fate's Messenger might want to migrate over to Harlequins, but maybe not. That's currently the most aggressive one, so maybe we get to hold on to that. I have other ideas about this, but I'm gonna move on to make more time to talk about other craft worlds. And again, I think that the obvious nerf to Warhost, if it were accompanied by appropriate points decreases, really would be okay. And I think that we need those points decreases to make many of our units viable in any detachment that isn't getting that insane reroll bonus. Oh, one last change that would be relevant for Biel-Tan. I do think it would make sense for the Avatar of Cain to have the Aspect Warrior keyword, which would make it possible to have some pretty crazy synergies, and you'd still get the reroll to wound on the Avatar. I think the Avatar of Cain, if it is, every craft world has one, right? But if any craft world should be running it hard, it should definitely be Biel-Tan. So I think it makes sense. Also, I'm sure all of you know that we wake the Avatar up by melting down some poor exarch who gets tortured to death and is somehow absorbed by or becomes the Avatar. So the notion that the Avatar would have the aspect warrior keyword certainly makes lore sense, and I think that would be a good also balancing mechanic for any disadvantage incurred by changing the rules for Warhost. All right, let's talk Craft World Saim-Hann, the jet bike elves, the Wild Rider Craft World, the Craft World where the signature unit is Guardians on bikes, and presumably the most common aspect warriors are Shining Spears, and where if you are running elves from this Craft World, you should be able to use a Autarch Skyrunner and not have it be terrible, which has been a challenge in 10th edition. Saim-Hann is also one of the craft world's most well-developed in the lore. There are a bunch of Gav Thorpe books that focus on this like Wild Rider clan. And in the last couple of editions of the game, the Red Elves, the Red Aeldari from Saim-Hann have been like the default stock photo pick for the edition. So there are a lot of reasons why we would want this one to be well supported. It's also fun to run something where your opponent looks at your army and you don't have to explain your personal lore for your world for them to understand the theme of the list. It's like you look at a Saim-Hann list, there are a bunch of bikes, you know what you're looking at. So I imagine on the table, Saim-Hann ought to do a couple of things. One, you want your bike units to be integral, to be really effective both for target elimination and for scoring. You want to be able to use that Autarch Skyrunner. You want to be fast and highly maneuverable. All elves are fast and maneuverable, but these should be the most fast and maneuverable of the elves. And I think this should probably also be the craft world that has the biggest bonus, or has a bonus, for mechanized infantry. It's always seemed kind of obvious to me that if you're running a Saim-Hann list, it would make sense to be starting all or at least most of your infantry in transports, certainly from a lore perspective. Otherwise, how are they keeping up with the Wild Riders screaming across the surface of the planet or the craft world or whatever it is, right? So I think it's also the mechanized infantry build. And I'll also say, right, in the codexes that have come out so far, like the craft world Biel-Tan, the detachment would not be called Biel-Tan. It would be called something that was evocative of craft world Biel-Tan, but if you're running some custom craft world or minor craft world like I do, Ibersil, that doesn't have rules, it's obvious that if you want your thing to be sort of generic Aeldari aggression and aspect warriors, you choose this, and maybe you're running Ibersil, so you have a lot of Howling Banshees, but it's not called the thing. So I imagine whatever the Saim-Hann detachment is also working for mechanized infantry, which could be its own thing. Nevertheless, here's how I think this could work really well and would be consistent with other 10th edition releases. I'm going to suggest 3 stratagems and 2 enhancements, as well as the detachment ability. I'll lead with the detachment ability. Many factions that have had codexes so far have had some detachment that gives them some bonus like this. For Saim-Hann, I imagine it being the one where all of your units can reroll advanced moves and are eligible to shoot and charge even after they've fallen back. Not necessarily after they've advanced, but I do think it would make sense to tack onto this detachment ability. Mounted units can make a charge move after advancing. So you get 3 things. Everybody can reroll advanced moves. Everybody can fall back and still shoot or charge. So those are maneuverability bonuses. And then mounted units can charge after advancing. That really only benefits Shining Spears and the Autarch Skyrunner. I think it would be fine. Shining Spears are not in any way overpowered in this edition. They were in the last edition. We've seen very few of them on tables, and the ability to alpha strike with them would get them there. But they're still not crazy hard hitting, and they're certainly not easy for an opponent to eliminate. But I think the Saim-Hann identity constructed around the notion you are the most maneuverable elves. You don't get bogged down in melee combat. You can keep zipping around the board, and your speedy lance units are just a little bit speedier. I think that makes sense. Generally, Wind Riders, Wild Riders are not charging into melee combat anyway. I keep wondering, at every edition, I sort of wonder if maybe we won't see some build where you get to choose whether or not you want to give your Wind Riders like a melee weapon, like the equivalent of like Storm Guardians. I don't think it's happening anytime soon, but I've always thought it would be cool for Saim-Hann. Anyway, strats. We obviously need something that benefits bog standard like Guardians on jet bikes. One of the big issues in 9th edition, the big problems, was that if you wanted to run Guardians on jet bikes, the Saim-Hann subfaction bonus was like not the best one. Like the best Guardians on jet bikes did not come from Saim-Hann in the last edition, and it was really disappointing. So we need for Wild Riders to be especially good. I think one way to do this would be to have a 1 CP strat that lets you choose a mounted unit, and at the end of your shooting phase, that unit can make a normal move. So essentially it's 1 CP fire and fade that you can only use on mounted units. Yes, you could use it on warlocks, on bikes, or spears. But I think that you wouldn't be able to charge after doing this, right? The same as with Fire and Fade. So the most obvious target would be Wild Riders. You could both do the thing that we do now with the Warhost attachment, where you move a big unit of like 9 Wild Riders being led by a Farseer who can throw Guide on them, tripped out, all with Shuriken cannons, where they light something up with crazy rerolls and sustained hits, and they wreck it, and then they move 14 inches away. Well, it would be 1 CP to do that instead of 2 CP, and because it's only 1 CP, you could also be using small units of Wild Riders for scoring purposes, right? Because they could move and then move again. 28 inches is really far. And if you were using the ones with just Shuriken catapults with an assault keyword, they could actually advance, shoot, and then make another 14-inch move, which would make them about as fast as Warp Spiders. And then you wouldn't need Warp Spiders because you shouldn't in a Saim-Hann list, and you could be doing your turn 1 far away, crazy secondary scoring with MSU units of Wind Riders, which is really how it should be, right? Your small units of Wind Riders would be your scoring units. Your big units of Wind Riders could wreck and stay alive. I would also love to see a stratagem that for 1 CP lets you select 2 units with the fly keyword and give them -1 to hit, like some sort of like, Lords of the Sky strat. So it would be lightning fast that affects 2 units, not 1 unit, but can only be used on units with the fly keyword. And so you can imagine that your jet bike units are just doing these like crazy maneuvers to avoid being hit, which makes a lot of sense. And again, we don't want to create a situation where the Warhost detachment is a better like Saim-Hann detachment than a Saim-Hann detachment, or a better Ulthwe detachment than an Ulthwe detachment. And so thinking about how to pick some traditional elf stuff like the -1 to hit, and then like micro focus it on the types of units that this particular craft world specializes in, I think makes a lot of sense. Lastly, I'd love to see a strat giving a combat bonus to infantry the turn that they come out of a transport. Remember, like the mechanized infantry thing? I think it would be cool if it was a player's choice between re-rolling either the hit roll or the charge roll. So like your Banshees coming out of a Wave Serpent would have crazy long threat ranges, but also if you're bringing some Dire Avengers out of a Wave Serpent, or if you're coming out of a Falcon, you'd actually be able to re-roll potentially, if you use the Falcon ability, both to hit roll and the shooting roll for a small unit of infantry for some Dire Avengers or something, and that would be really cool. And I think it's really important to keep in mind also when we are thinking about whether or not stuff is or is not OP, that we're all super accustomed to playing elves in a world in which all of your units get to re-roll 1 hit roll and 1 wound roll. So you've got to remember that all of our units have lost some killingness simply by virtue of not being in that Warhost detachment anymore. And so having some strats that pick up some of that slack, I think, makes a lot of sense. As for enhancements, I think that we obviously need the relic jet bike, the Sunstorm, which has existed in multiple editions, and also Kane's Lance. Both of these were really cool back in 9th. I think Kane's Lance would be a great opportunity to make a Autarch Skyrunner not suck. Currently, the Skyrunner doesn't have the damage output to be a combat character and can only lead Wind Riders, which don't want to be in melee, but he's a melee character, so there's like nothing for him to do. I think it would be really cool if in this edition Kane's Lance was a Star Lance, so not a Laser Lance, that you can only currently give the Autarch Skyrunner the Laser Lance, not like the better one, was a Star Lance that functioned the same way as the grenade strat on the charge. So you charge something with it, you roll 6 die, and for every 4 up, it just takes a mortal wound in the charge phase, which is exactly how the grenade strat works for 1 CP, and everybody in the game has access to the grenade strat except for Tyranids. So, I think legit, and then you would initiate combat with a slightly better than normal Poke Lance. Also, one of the balancing mechanics with this is that it would only be badass when you charge with it, which makes sense. If somebody catches your Autarch Skyrunner flat-footed and he gets charged, then he's just like a mediocre combat character. But he could do some work for you. He'd be that slim target elimination torpedo to blow something off of an objective or put some final wounds on an enemy tank or monster, or really do whatever you needed him to do. Mortal wounds are so versatile, right? Which would make a lot of sense. You should be able to have that character in a Saim-Hann list. And then for the Sunstorm, in 9th edition, this was really cool. You could put it on either the Autarch Skyrunner or on a Farseer Skyrunner, and it both gave you a move characteristic of 20 and also gave you objective secured, which in 9th edition meant that if you were jumping on an objective with any enemy unit that wasn't troops, wasn't like a battle line unit, you just automatically took the objective away from them. And that was cool. It was fun, and it was very like elf trickery-ish. Everything should not be about killing. One of the reasons that 40k is fun is that it isn't just about destroying your opponent's army. It's this neat tactics game. I think the way to have a 10th edition version of the Sunstorm, because OBSEC doesn't exist anymore, is to have the 20-inch move characteristic, but then if the unit on the Sunstorm is on an objective with enemy models on that objective have their OC reduced by 1. Right? So it would basically do the same thing that it did before. If you jumped onto an objective with regular enemy infantry that had objective control of 1, they'd all go to a 0. If it were an enemy battle line unit, they'd go from a 2 to a 1. So they'd still have a bunch of objective control on the unit. But I think this would make a lot of sense, work well, and be an interesting tactic that isn't just about killing. And I think that there just isn't one of my only complaints about Space Elves in 10th edition is I miss all the elf trickery. I feel like there used to be a lot more tricks, and now elves have been just sort of more of a blunt instrument. So I'd like to see some of the trickery come back when we get our codex. Okay, Ulthwe. In many editions, Ulthwe have been the flagship faction for Space Elves. They're certainly one of the most iconic Space Elf factions, and they are the home craft world of probably the most famous Aeldari character in the lore, Eldrad. And Ulthwe's thing is relying on very powerful psychers, maybe having more psychers on the field than other craft worlds, and really relying on those psychic buffs, and then not having a lot of aspect warriors, instead having a lot of guardians and having the best guardians. The black guardians are revered throughout Space Elf civilization as the most elite of the non-elite citizen soldiers, for lore reasons that we won't rehash right now. But it seems obvious that on the table, Ulthwe should rely more heavily on psychic buffs than other factions, other sub-factions, and in addition, that there should always be reasons to have guardians, right? Like, guardians should be good. You should want guardians and maybe less incentivized to run aspect warriors. Although all the aspect shrines exist on Ulthwe, if I look at an Ulthwe force, I should see a bunch of psychers and a bunch of guardians. So here's how I imagine that might play out. I would love to see, this is like one of the ideas that I think is probably least probable, but I would love to see if you're running Ulthwe as your sub-faction, if units that have the psyker keyword are allowed to apply psychic abilities that normally would require them to lead a unit, instead to a unit within 9 inches, a single unit within 9 inches. So essentially, like, for example, the Foot Guardians who have Quicken, which lets you, if you're leading a unit, automatically advance 6 when you make an advance, or Restrain. Each time an enemy unit declares a charge, if it's against the unit that the Guardian is leading, you subtract 2 from the charge roll. Well, I think it would be cool if you're running Ulthwe, if those powers did not require you to be leading the unit. So I just get to pick a unit with a 9 inches. I either pick an enemy unit with a 9 inches of me that is at -2 to charge, or I pick a unit with a 9 inches of the Space Elf Psyker that can just add 6 when it advances. So for Skyrunners, I would either be able to, with a Skyrunner, choose to make to give a unit stealth to make a unit -1 to hit, or I could choose to let a unit ignore cover if that unit was in 9 inches of the Psyker in the command phase, or at the end of the movement phase, or whatever. Oh, it's the command. It says the command phase on the data sheet. Now, this would not really affect how Farseers work, because Farseers already work that way. Like a Foot Farseer can choose to put Fortune on anything. But this would mean that your Warlocks, which should be the backbone, I think, of an Ulthwe list, would suddenly be useful. And Warlocks really haven't been very useful in 10th edition for the simple reason that they only buff the units that they're leading, and generally speaking, those units are not super worth having. This is not true of a single Warlock Skyrunner running with Wind Riders. The ability to strip cover is really good. But it would just make so much sense, and it would be so much better, I think, if Warlocks were more broad-based in their abilities, and I think that this would be very easy to achieve with an Ulthwe detachment ability. I think you could require line of sight. I think it would be cool if you didn't. The Warlocks would be more survivable, but if we were worried at all about game balance, this would make sense. And requiring line of sight would also make it a little bit easier for your opponent to maybe eliminate some of these leader characters. And honestly, I think the ability to use Warlocks in this way would be such an advantage that you don't need another thing. You know, you'd have all of these like sub-commanders running around on the field that would be able to buff a bunch of your units, and in some case debuff enemy units, and that would really be your that would be your core strategic mechanic. Obviously, we need the Discipline of the Black Guardians, as they don't have their own data card in this edition, which I honestly think makes sense. I think Discipline of the Black Guardians wants to be a stratagem, and you need to do it in a way that doesn't make them like automatically better than Dire Avengers or something. So what I would do is make this a 1 CP strat that you use when you are either shooting or fighting with a unit of Ulthwe Guardians, or it's not called Ulthwe. I don't know what we'd call the detachment. Like, I don't know what it would be called, but until your next command phase, weapons equipped by models in this unit would have sustained hits 1. So extra hits on 6s. And then perhaps, and if there's a friendly Psyker unit within 6 inches, models in the squad also have lethal hits of 1. Now, Guardians, Shuriken Catapults have half the rate of fire of Dire Avenger Catapults. And Dire Avengers already get lethal hits without spending CP. So, Dire Avengers would still be their own thing, and they would still be good. But I think this would be a way of making Ulthwe Guardians scary. If I throw a little CP at them, suddenly they're pumping out extra hits. And if I have a Warlock nearby or a Farseer nearby, now with the ability to do lethal hits when I hit, your Guardian units would be able to do pretty decent chip damage to anything. And this would make some Guardian units worth having. You would want at least a couple of blocks of Guardians, I think, in each Ulthwe list, and the backbone of your list would be your Psykers, and I think that would be really cool. Lastly, I'd love to see a defensive psychic stratagem, like a psychic shield stratagem. I imagine this giving out Feel No Pain saves. So in earlier editions, the Ulthwe thing was everybody from Craft World Ulthwe has a 6-up Feel No Pain. GW has tried to get away from these kind of bland and uninteresting sub-faction bonuses to do stuff that's more tactically interesting and a little bit more dynamic. So what I would love to see is if there was a 1 CP strat that let you choose a unit that did not have the Vehicle, Monster, or Wraith construct keyword and get a 6-up Feel No Pain until end of phase, But if there's a Psyker within 6 inches, I'd love to see that be a 5-up, feel no pain. So again, you're incentivized to keep your Psykers near your units, and you couldn't create super ridiculously durable wraiths with this. You couldn't make the avatar impossible to kill, right? This would only work on bikes and infantry. So I don't think it would be overpowered, because everything that's not wraith infantry is pretty fragile anyway, and bikes are fragile. They're like a Space Marine. I don't think this would be in any way OP, and I think it would dovetail nicely with that Ulthwe flavor, where you want to have your Psykers near your units, buffing them, giving them orders, talking to them telepathically, and generally being super cool psychic space elves. Now, as far as relics go, I think there are enhancements, right? So in previous editions, there were relics and there were warlord traits. I think that a classic that we've seen over many editions is Seer of the Shifting Vector. I think that's obviously an Ulthwe enhancement. Now, in the past, it's been a way to generate CP, and I think that's what it wants to be again, because I think in an Ulthwe list, you should maybe not be incentivized to run an Autarch. Maybe there should be a way to generate additional CP with your Farseer. Now, it would certainly be convenient if it just, for, say, 25 points, gave a model with the Psyker keyword the Autarch ability, where you just generate an extra CP on your turn. I think if you want to make the player roll in the command phase and only get it on a 2-up, that's certainly fine. But some way for an Ulthwe player who's not running an Autarch to generate extra CP using psychic means would certainly make a lot of sense. Okay, Iyanden. Iyanden, theoretically, is the craft world that you're running if what you want to run is a Wraith host. If you want your opponent to look at your army and think, Wraiths. I think Wraith hosts are, and it probably should just be called Wraith host, right? I think Wraith hosts are without a doubt the most popular thematic build for Aeldari, where it just has a very clear and obvious theme. They're very compelling for new players. There's a lot to recommend them. It's the least, if you were to build a true Wraith host, it is the least expensive Aeldari army that you could build, because Wraiths are relatively affordable, but they're worth a lot of points. In order to make this, so first of all, your Wraiths, obviously, in an Iyanden list, you should have the best Wraiths from any craft world. There should be an incentive to run a lot of them, and any Wraith host will also have to offset some of the disadvantages inherent to running Wraith units that have made it pretty hard in 10th edition to competitively run a true Wraith host after the first Wild West weeks of the edition, when Wraith Knights just dominated everything, such that there was like no point in playing 40k unless you had at least 2 Wraith Knights on the table. That was just like the first, I don't know, six weeks of the edition, or 2 months. It was brief. Okay, so Iyanden. I think they're aside from being Wraiths, the whole Iyanden thematic thing is that they're like stoic, you know? They're tough-minded and much hardier than elves from other worlds. So if there's any opportunity to run a durability build for elves, it should be running this. The detachment ability I have in mind is not like, it's not super crazy powerful, but I think it makes sense thematically, and I think that it is easily balanced out with really good strats and relics. So I think the Wraith host bonus should be you can reroll the first failed battle shock test each player turn. Battle shock has not turned out to be as big a deal in 10th edition as we originally thought, but it is an issue if your Wraith suddenly can't control an objective because they failed a battle shock test. And I also think that it would make sense for, in a Wraith host, all Wraith constructs to get a 6-up feel no pain. Now, that is not a huge increase to their durability, except it kind of is, because when you have 3 wound models with a 6-up feel no pain, when you roll those 3 dice, there is a roughly 50% chance that you're going to get at least 1 6, which means about half the time weapons that just do flat 3 damage don't kill them. So you create this like damage inefficiency against the type of weapon that should be most efficient at killing them. It doesn't really help you with stuff that does flat 2 generally, but it does it does make them less vulnerable to the most efficient weapons for eliminating them. And Iyanden should have the most durable Wraith constructs, since durability and Wraith constructs are their thing. Now, another problem that Wraith hosts face is very, very poor OBSEC. So I imagine them having a 1 CP strat, Indomitable, where you just add +1 to the OC rating of models in this unit until end of phase. Note that you would not have to use this on Wraith's constructs. You could also have other stuff in your Iyanden army, because they have all the aspect shrines, run onto an objective with your Howling Banshees and double the OC. And one of your things as an Iyanden player then would just be I dominate objectives with better OC. And I think that's very thematic. And it's also kind of unusual for elves who typically want to keep their heads down a bit more. I think that one of the issues we also face with running Wraiths is that in order to be really durable, in order to be really effective as an Anvil unit, they need to typically have Fortune on them, right? A Foot Farseer can throw Fortune on a unit, make it -1 to wound. One of the reasons people sometimes don't want to run both the Avatar of Cain and a big block of Wraiths, for example, is that you can only throw Fortune on one of them, and if you don't have Fortune on both of them, one of them slightly underperforms. Although it is a thing right now to do these triple Anvil Aeldari builds, nevertheless, it's something people worry about. So I think a 1P CP, maybe 2 CP strat, Fury of the Dead, that let you pick a unit of Wraith constructs, whatever it is. You can do this to a Wraith Knight or a Wraith Lord. And give them -1 to wound until end of turn, and then you could use your Farseer to either put the same thing on another Wraith unit or some other unit, would make the Iyanden detachment the most durable Aeldari detachment. I think that would be cool. I think it would make sense. I think it would work really well. The other challenge that Wraith constructs face is they all hit on just 4-ups, which is, unless they're led by a Spirit Seer, annoying. It is for this reason that the only Wraith constructs that are really getting play are occasionally Wraith Knights, although they've been so wildly reined in and point increased that not really. And Wraith Infantry being led by a Spirit Seer who can get them to a 3-up. So I think a 1 CP strat that gave them +1 to hit until end of turn would be really good. Focus, I would call it focus. So you could either make your Wraith Knight or your Wraiths led by a Spirit Seer. You could make them hit on a 2-up, which would be amazing. And then your other stuff, like the Hemlock Wraith Fighter, which kind of sucks because it hits on 4s, or just your Wraith Lords, which kind of suck because they hit on 4s. They could get to 3s. If we're worried about this being OP for the units that could get to a 2, instead of saying they get +1 to hit, you could say focus, they hit on a 3-up, and maybe that can't be modified, right? They'll always hit on an unmodified roll of 3-up, which would prevent you from being able to get to 2s and maybe combine it with other stuff to be OP. But it would make your Wraith shooting and fighting a lot more reliable, and that's really one of the things that's most missing from any Iyanden build. I've only got one thought on enhancements, one place where I have strong feelings. We need the Tome of Iyanden, people. We want that thing. That's existed in many editions. Typically what it's done is it's like a one-use spooky book thing that you burn to wildly increase the damage output of your Wraith units. I think what I'm proposing is actually the exact same thing that existed in some other edition, but the way I imagine this working is it can only be used by an HQ model leading Wraith units, so it would have to be a Spirit Seer. And once per game, you use it up so that either in the shooting phase or in the fight phase, models in that unit double their attack characteristic. So you get one really hard hit from either your Wraith Infantry or a Wraith Lord, because those are the only units that can be led by a Spirit Seer. And you could see how in combination with Focus, right? That could be your big play as a Wraith player. And one of the things I like about this is it would give people a reason to actually take Ghost Swords, because if you double the attack characteristic of the Ghost Swords, now they're really doing some work. I think they're the coolest looking Wraith Infantry, and currently there's no room for play for those. So those are my thoughts on Iyanden. I think if we could make them a little bit more durable, make them hit reliably, and give them a couple of I go hard here tricks, I think that Wraith constructs as a as like a theme could work great. Okay, Alaitoc. Alaitoc is the scouty, rangery craft world where everybody's an amateur natty bumpo. Theoretically, if you are running Alaitoc, you want to put a lot of rangers on the table, and you want these rangers to not merely be disposable move blocking and scoring units, but actually have some combat effectiveness. Theoretically, you will also be using some Shroud Runners, and this is probably also going to be like a duck and cover, ambushy, shooty rather than melee playstyle. I am going to suggest, obviously, a detachment ability, a couple of stratagems, and then a couple of enhancements also. And as much as I would like to say we should bring back 9th edition battle focus for Alaitoc, where every unit gets to move several inches after it shoots, there's just really no way to balance that and have it not be insane. So we can't do that. But one of the mechanics that we see a lot in 10th edition is the units get to move 6 inches when an opponent finishes a move within 9 inches of them. I think that this, so it's the ranger ability. It's the thing that rangers do, right? I think that this should just be like everybody can do this. At the very least, all of your infantry and bikes. I really don't think it would be terribly game breaking if we just let all Alaitoc units do that. Presumably, almost all or many of them have been rangers at some point, so it makes sense that they would all know how to do the ranger thing. Again, I think there's probably an argument for not maybe letting your Avatar of Cain do this, or your wave serpents or whatever, so it's not like super hard for your opponent to charge any of your monsters or your vehicles. But I do think at the very least for infantry and bikes this would make a lot of sense, and it's certainly an ability that is widespread in 10th edition. Not quite as potent as maybe the Warhost power, so we would, or some of the others I've suggested. So we definitely need some pretty excellent strats and enhancements to balance that out. First and foremost, I think we need for rangers to be actually like good as a combat unit, and so I would love to see a 1 CP picked shots stratagem that would give a unit of rangers equipped with long rifles devastating wounds and let them reroll 1s to wound. It's a low rate of fire unit, so but if you were running 10 of these things and they were all rerolling 1s to wound, and if you used an HQ unit to let them also reroll hit rolls or something, and if you don't move them, they hit on 2s, right? Because of the heavy keyword, you could push a few devastating wounds through pretty reliably, a couple of devastating wounds through probably with a unit of ranger long rifles. Your rangers would be reasonably reliable chip damage against everything, and it would suddenly be in your best interest, especially if we had some more things that benefited them, to run a fair number of these in an Alaitoc list, and that should be incentivized. I'd like to see, I mentioned that I think that probably the Warhost attachment that I imagine going over to Biel-Tan doesn't need both Fire and Fade and Phantasm. I imagined a new Biel-Tan-y stratagem replacing Phantasm. I'd like to see Phantasm migrate over to Alaitoc in its original form, unnerfed, where it's a 1 CP for a 7-inch move with 1 unit. That's just any unit. That's really powerful, and I think that it would be one of the single best reasons to play Alaitoc, is that, yeah, the Warhost detachment can do it and make a full move, not a 7-inch move, but it's 2 CP. And the difference between 2 CP and 1 CP is pretty significant. You could, I suppose, limit it to just infantry and bikes the way it is now. At the beginning of the edition, it was not. And I think that because the overall detachment power for Alaitoc, I think, is not quite as potent as some of the other ones we've considered, I really think it would make sense to just let them have old school Phantasm and have that be awesome. They're the duck and cover, shooty, don't want to engage you craft world. So let's let them have it. I'd like to see a durability strat. So I guess I'm suggesting 3 with a cooler, a more thematic name than elusive as fuck, but that's basically what I'm imagining. I think it would be cool if you could make it impossible for one of your units to have rerolls against it. So your opponent picks a target in the shooting phase, and you say no rerolls to hit or wound for 1 CP because we are elusive as fuck. As far as enhancements go, I think that this is the craft world that obviously needs the redeploy enhancement. For the last couple of editions, there's been sort of a complicated relationship on the part of the game designers with when they're going to let players redeploy and whether they're going to let them redeploy after the deployment phase ends. I think there should be. Oh no, this would have to be an enhancement, right? Because you wouldn't have CP at the start of the game for this. So I think there should be an enhancement that. Oh, I think I said that. An enhancement that lets you redeploy after deployment ends and after you know who's going first 3 of your units. I think that's very appropriate for Alaitoc. I don't think it's out of control, and I think the option to put those units into reserve also totally makes sense. Again, that's obviously really good, but keep in mind, we don't have the Warhost power where we're always re-rolling hit rolls, and we don't have the index version of it where we're also always re-rolling a wound roll, and all of these sub-faction builds should be viable. So I think it's totally reasonable. Lastly, there's a classic Alaitoc enhancement, Mark of the Incomparable Hunter, where one of your HQs is just like, what was the name of that? What was that name of that? Like, was it Craven? What a terrible name. That Marvel comic, like, guy with evil Crocodile Dundee, teeth in his hat, hunter dude from like the 80s. I don't know. It turns one of your HQs into that guy. I think it would be great if Mark of the Incomparable Hunter was a particularly good pick for the Foot Autarch, the one that doesn't have the jump pack, who's gotten like no play in this edition. I think Mark of the Incomparable Hunter should provide lone operative and give shooting attacks +1 strength and precision. I think that would be great. You could give your foot slogging Autarch a Reaper launcher as well as lone operative, so she's not targetable, and +1 strength and precision. Or you could make your Farseer and an Alaitoc list just much safer. I think it's very thematic, and I think it's totally reasonable, and I think given the sorts of bonuses we're considering for other sub-factions, I think definitely not OP. Whenever I think about these, how you would design sub-factions, I always try to imagine, like, if this were my thing, if Alaitoc were my go-to craft world, what would I be happy playing with? What would be fun? And too often I think what we end up with when codexes come out is 1 or 2 pretty competitive ones, and then a couple that are sort of mid, and then 2 that are obviously just narrative. And I understand the wisdom of that, but come on, man. If like one of those is your thing, if you are a Alaitoc player and an Ulthwe player, it kind of sucks if your detachment went in the narrative and for fun bin. So I would like to see all of these be functional, and I think this would make that work. Okay, let's talk mono Harlequin builds. And I think we just need to start by acknowledging that Harlequin players have been done dirty in 10th edition. For many editions, Harlequins have been their own faction. And many people collected Harlequins without collecting craft worlds. They were Harlequin players, not craft world players who had some Harlequins. And at least at the beginning of 10th edition, with the index, Harlequins went from being very much their own thing to like one of the fun flavor options for a craft worlds player. You put in some Harlequin units, and yeah, you could run a Harlequin list, but it's not really competitive. I think that there needs to be a detachment that is a mono Harlequin detachment, where you only get to use this detachment if all of the units in the detachment have the Harlequin keyword, and as such you get some pretty badass abilities. And so some of the stuff that I suggest may sound a little bit OP, but I think if you keep in mind that you're going, if you go this route, you're going from having access to something like 67 different units to having access to like 7 or so. There have to be some significant gains here, right? And so here's how I imagine this working. First off, I think if every unit in your army has the Harlequin keyword, the Shadow Seer should get the Autarch ability. That is, if the Shadow Seer is your warlord, you should be able to generate an extra CP every turn if the Shadow Seer is still alive, if the warlord Shadow Seer is still alive. I don't think you should get 6 fate dice. I think you should go back to getting 9. I think that there should be a Harlequin ability that lets you re-roll all 9 of these at the beginning, or all of the remaining ones at the beginning of every battle round if you want to. Because the way Harlequins used to work when they had their own thing that was kind of like fate dice but not fate dice, it was like there was a gambling thing and you would roll them, and it was like this overly complex gambling mechanic that GW got rid of because it was overly complex. But I think just having the option to pick up your fate dice at the beginning of any round and re-roll them makes sense. But the twist is you've got to re-roll all of them, right? It's not like I get to re-roll some of them. It's like I can always re-roll all of them. So it's always like I'm gambling with Kegorok, which I think would be cool. And a lot of the units that get to make like sick use of fate dice, you just don't have access to as a mono Harlequin player. I mean, your Void Weavers can hit extra hard, but there isn't anything else that's really like going crazy with the 6s on the fate dice. I think troops obviously need to get battle line. If you're running mono Harlequins, you shouldn't have to make a troop leader your warlord so that your troops can get battle line. I mean, that's silly. For one thing, surely troop masters lead troops. Your Shadow Seer leads like a Harlequin detachment. So you shouldn't have to make your B-list command guy your general in order to do the thing. It doesn't make sense to me. So yeah, troops get battle line. 9 fate dice instead of 6, can reroll them at the beginning of any round. Shadow Seers get the Autarch ability. I think that's a solid start. I would also frankly like to see the Shadow Seer unit card rewritten so that instead of letting the unit, if it's leading a unit, Twilight Pathways, instead of letting that unit just be faster, I would love to see it get like the Swooping Hawk ability where you like disappear back into the webway and you come out somewhere else. So your command, your HQ unit, your command unit that could have a Troop Master in it also, because I think you should be able to attach both a Troop Master and a Shadow Seer to like one unit, would have the option to just kind of like teleport around the board. That's very Harlequin-y. The next thing that I think needs to happen with reference to the strats and the enhancements, your troops have to stop sucking. Like, troops are kind of okay. They're pretty good if they're led by Yvraine, but like troops should be good if they're not Ynnari. And they're like okay if they're led by a troop master and they charge. But there have to be some ways to make your troops do your heavy lifting. Because remember, you don't have fire prisms anymore. You don't have Wraith infantry anymore. You don't have the Avatar anymore. Troops have to be able to really mess stuff up. Your bikes are pretty good at killing enemy tanks, but Harlequins really struggle into durable infantry and monsters. So there have to be some workarounds. Here's something that I think would be a great workaround. Currently, Harlequin troops get +1 to wound in melee when they charge. Not bad. If they're led by a troop master, who's 55 points, they also get devastating wounds. I think, which is good, it's good, but it doesn't get you there. It's not enough for a Harlequin troop to really mess up a tough target. I think there should be a stratagem that lets a unit of Harlequin players use modified dice for devastating wounds. So instead of getting your dev wounds on 6s, when led by a troop master and making a charge, you would get them on 5s. And given just the sheer volume of attacks a big Harlequin troop could put into something led by a troop master, you could just push through a shitload of devastating wounds on something. You would need a CP to do it. You could only do it in one place on the field. It would only work on a turn in which you charged. But Harlequins need a way to deal with super durable targets, and this would do it. And by the way, there's precedent in the game for this. I mean, stuff that is anti-infantry and has devastating wounds, or anti-vehicle or whatever, already works this way, right? There's already lots of stuff in the game that can get devastating wounds into particular targets on a 4-up or 5-up, or sometimes even better. So yes, I'm imagining that this would work against anything, but it would work only with your troop units and only with one. And it's worth noting that the largest troop unit you could have running around would be 6, because in a transport, because which would be the real risk, right? Because the Wave Serpent couldn't go in the list if you were satisfying the Harlequin detachment rules. So I think troops need a way to be super killing in melee the way they were in every other edition, and I think that this would be a really good way to do it that would still involve tactical complexity, resource sacrifice, and difficult decision making, instead of just making all of your troops slam all the time. There should be a stratagem that lets a Harlequin troop advance and charge. There obviously should. I think that there should be a stratagem. Webway Warriors. Do you remember that? I think it was like a custom craft world ability or something. I think there should be a Webway Warrior stratagem that lets a unit within 12 inches of a Shadow Seer go back into Deep Strike. Because you don't have access to Swooping Hawks, and you don't have access to Warp Spiders. You don't have access to Shadow Specters. So you need a way for your Harlequins to teleport around the field and be scoring units. So obviously, your MSU cheap-ass player troops need to be able to be your scoring units. I think there should be a stratagem like Kegarak's Blessing. Enemy units don't get any rerolls against that unit. I know that I already suggested this for, I think, Alaitoc. I could even imagine a version of this for Harlequins if you want to make it different from the Alaitoc stratagem, where you pick either one unit or two units, but they both have to be Harlequin troops. And I think it would be cool to have a strat that let a single Harlequin unit reroll all of its saving throws against a single enemy unit for one phase. Not all of its invulnerable saves against everything, but against a single enemy unit. So, because you don't have access to any hyper durable units as a mono Harlequin player. And even this, you'd be very durable against, if you rolled well, against one enemy unit. You wouldn't have an Avatar of Cain, you wouldn't have Wraith Infantry, but you'd have something. As far as artifacts go, I think that we need a bunch of combat artifacts, mostly for troop masters, so that troop masters attached to various player troops around the board can pick up your target elimination slack. I would like to see Kegarak's Rose come back, the Storied Sword come back, and the Suit of Hidden Knives come back. Maybe one of these would also be viable on like a Shadow Seer, maybe the Suit of Hidden Knives or something. I'm not worried about exactly how they work as long as they give Harlequins play into hard targets, which is where they really suffer. Lastly, I don't think it would be a bad thing if the Death Jester got Fate's Messenger automatically and we increased his points cost appropriately. Because currently there's like this weird tax on people who just don't know that in order to run a Death Jester effectively, it needs to have Fate's Messenger. No even marginally competitive player, nobody runs the Death Jester without Fate's Messenger. I think it would make sense for it just to be built in. The only argument for not doing that is then you could have multiple Death Jesters that could do the thing. And so maybe it's not a good idea. But at the very least, I think that Fate's Messenger should migrate over, if we're not going to build it in, such that mono Harlequin players get to throw that on their Death Jesters instead of like Death Jesters and Biel-Tan builds just being extra cool. So yeah, if I were running the show over at Aeldari GW, which obviously I'm not, and as far as I know, no one knows who I am, that's what I would do with clowns, and that would make me really excited to play clowns. Okay, and lastly, Ynnari. Ynnari are not a craft world. They wouldn't have a generic detachment name. They are really a separate sub-faction of death-worshipping, creepy death elf cultists who all follow around the Herald of Yned or Yniad, or however it is we're saying that, the new space elf god of death who was created through this wacko ritual thing, and now Yvrain, the herald of the god of death, says that if enough space elves die, they will overwhelm Slaanesh, destroying 1/4 of chaos and liberating all of the elf souls that Slaanesh has eaten. So their whole thing is not carrying around spirit stones and instead dying. There are 3 signature Ynnari models, right? There's Yvrain herself with her lie cat lady, and then there is the Yinkarn, her bodyguard, who never says anything and follows her around being all mysterious like Casey Jones and the Ninja Turtles. And then there is the Yinkarn, a shard of the god of death that she can summon in the same way that like the Avatar is a shard of Cain. And what distinguishes a Ynnari force is that it pulls units not only from Harlequins and regular Aeldari, but also Drakari, although they can't use the homunculus coven stuff. The current index rules make it possible to play Ynnari by making your Vrain your warlord, and she's got some cool benefits, but and you get access to some Drakari units, and you can't use the Avatar, you can't use the Phoenix Lords if you're doing this. But otherwise, they're just they're just space elves. I really hope in the Codex that Ynnari get their own detachment, that they don't continue just being like a spin-off of the Warhost detachment or whatever. And I have some thoughts on if they get their own detachment, how that ought to work. I think it's pretty clear from a lore interacts with tactics perspective what Ynnari want to be, what they should be. Ynnari should be a melee-oriented, highly aggressive trading army. The way trading armies work is that at the end of the game, you assume that you will have almost nothing left, but you will have a few things left that will be better at scoring than the things that your opponent has. So this is like the opposite of a lot of other elf builds, which are largely about keeping your most important tools on the table and taking out your opponent with cool synergies and combos. At the end of a game as a Ynnari player, most of your models should be gone. It just makes sense. Vrain's whole thing is all the elves need to die, so obviously. And they're super melee oriented. The other interesting lore thing is that she's flying around on Corsair ships, so there should be some sort of like thematic Corsair element on the table. Here's how I imagine this working. So the traditionally the Ynnari subfaction ability has been called Strength from Death, and then what that means has been different in different editions. Here's what I think would be great for Strength from Death. One, I think non-monsters should be able to fight on death in melee on a 4-up. So this is a very common mechanic in 10th edition. A model dies, you roll a d6 on a 4-up. It gets to fight one more time like it was totally healthy before you remove it from the table. And because Ynnari want to be a high casualty melee trading army, the ability to get into melee, to fight, to do some damage, to die, but then fight again, like that's really cool. And I think we should be incentivized to construct our armies around that mechanic. I historically haven't been a huge fan of fight on death abilities unless they're auto. I think if this were auto, it would be too much. I think 4-up is good. I also have an idea about how that could potentially be even better. And then the other thing that I imagine is giving units that are below starting strength fight first. I have not historically been a big fan of units below starting strength get some sort of bonus abilities because it incentivizes you to have your units damaged, and that's weird. But I think as a fights first ability, it makes a lot of sense because oftentimes in melee, units are not taken out entirely in a single turn. And so the ability to be guaranteed a second round of melee because you're going to fight first, say as the defending player, not with just one of your units that's starting engaged in melee, but maybe all of your units that start engaged in melee, if they are damaged. If they're damaged, and they probably are because they were probably damaged in the first round of combat, could be really good. Some of you are seriously not won over yet, and I totally get that, so hear me out. Here are my other ideas. I'm going to say more about Ynnari than I've said about some of the others because they really are, I think, they're like Harlequins. I said a lot about Harlequins. They're kind of like a fundamentally different subfaction, more so than some of the other detachments. So here are some strats that I think would be great. I would love to see Ancestor. There has always been a Ynnari ability called Ancestor's Grace. I think at the beginning of the fight phase, choose a unit, and that unit gets fights first. I think so. Like even if you're not below starting strength, the ability to fight first in melee on your opponent's turn. You should be incentivized to get into melee and crazy good in melee. This should be the Ynnari thing. There's always been a Ynnari ability called Unbind Souls. I would love to see a 1 CP stratagem that gives you +1 to wound in melee against enemy units that are below starting strength. So this would also be a way for Ynnari players who don't want to take a bunch of fire prisms and stuff with their witches and their their banshees and whatever else they're running to just be especially good even into hard targets that they're trying to trade out for. I'd love to see a strat that lets you there's always been a strat called, or it's been a psychic power in the past, but I think it would make sense as a stratagem. Shield of Ynned or whatever we're saying. Pick a unit within 12 inches of a friendly psyker. that unit gets -1 to hit and a 6-up feel no pain. So it's just like lightning fast reactions, except you have to be within 12 inches of a psyker, but it also gives you a 6-up feel no pain. So a little bit of a defensive boost to get you into melee as you're closing. I'd love to see a strat that makes that when you trigger inevitable death. I'm sorry. When you trigger strength from death, excuse me, instead of fighting on a 4-up, you fight on a 3-up. And incidentally, I think that the strength from death ability should only apply to non-monsters. There are no melee vehicles, so they don't really matter. But I don't think you should be able to do this with the Ynnari. I think that would be out of control. The fact that Wraith Lords kind of miss out on it, I think is just kind of like a casualty of easy rolls, I think. But I could imagine this only applying to bikes and infantry, and vehicles doesn't really matter. But I think that would be fine. But the ability to spend a CP to be able to do it on a 3-up and make it a little bit more reliable, so the central bonus mechanic of the faction isn't always super swingy, would make sense. Lastly, I'd love to see a stratagem that rewards you for including Corsairs, because that makes sense thematically. So I've got an idea that there could be a strat like Servants of Death or like Deathly Crew, because then you also have an allusion to Coleridge, that you play on a unit that's led by a Ynnari HQ. So both Yvraine and the Ynnari can lead Guardians, they can lead Harlequins, they can lead some Drakara units, they can lead Corsairs. And I think it would be cool if the way this worked is that you can only play it on a unit led by a Ynnari HQ, and models in that unit that do not have the leader keyword, so not Yvraine or the Ynnari, reroll wound rolls of 1. And then if it's Corsairs, if they have the Corsair keyword, they just reroll the wound roll. So your Corsairs led by Yvraine would be pretty badass. Corsairs also, because they have a mechanic where they get to just reroll ones to hit, and if you're assaulting someone on an objective, they also reroll the hit roll. You could end up with a unit of Corsair infantry that's rerolling to hit and rerolling to wound, which could be really good. They have really good armor pen with their swords. They're cheap. They're fragile. That's certainly not going to be game breaking, but you could have this like pretty cool space pirate assault force running around with the Queen of Death, and that would be neat. And I think it's something that's been missing in like every edition up until now. Now, keep in mind that if you're running with all of these bonuses, if you're choosing to run Ynnari, you get the added bonus of access to some Drakara units, and you're giving up the Avatar and the Phoenix Lords. And it may seem like because you get access to all of those other units, that maybe getting this much cool stuff is too much cool stuff. I really don't think it is, for the simple reason that the Avatar's amazing. It's one of the best units in the game. You're losing that. And it's not like the challenge that Space Elves were facing before was insufficient unit choice. You have well over 60 units to choose from already, so the option to opt into some Drakara units, which largely overlap with Aeldari stuff anyway, it's not too crazy. Like the ability to use Scourges, that's really cool. But for the most part, I don't think that the advantage introduced by access to those Drakara units is going to mean that this other stuff ends up being overpowered. I have a couple thoughts on relics. But really, I think the strats and the strength from death ability are going to be the most important thing. The notion that you're incentivized to get into melee, you have a way to guarantee that you fight first. You get a bonus if you're fighting something that's below starting strength, and then theoretically you could make that whole unit fight on death if it's killed in melee, and it potentially could trigger that same bonus again. It would just create this super cool, like, multi-part overlapping buff power punch with these like relatively puny melee units that need to die, which is how Ynnari should be functioning. But here are my ideas for enhancements. Historically, there's been a relic called Lost Shroud. I think that relic should exist again, and I think it could do exactly what it did in 9th edition. Reduce the damage characteristic of incoming damage by 1, and if you're up against weapons with a damage characteristic of 1, get +1 to your regular saving throw. So, if you threw this on an Autarch, it would make your Autarch more robust in melee, and that would make sense for a Ynnari Autarch. That could be cool. Here's a totally new one. I like the idea of, because Ynnari would, I think, want to be so focused on trapping opponents in like high casualty melee combat, I think having a relic or a way to keep opponents from falling back makes sense. So I would love to see like Embrace of Ynnari or something, such that if an enemy unit tries to fall back, they have to roll a d6. On a 1 through 3, they can't fall back, and on a 4 up, they can fall back, but they take d3 mortal wounds, right? So there's a cost. I catch you, I keep you here with my appeal to the Eldar death god, and you have to be you're punished if you try to leave. And that, my friends, is what I've got. I have other ideas for all of these, but I don't want this video to be even longer than it already is. I'm really excited about the 10th edition Codex. I'm really excited about seeing much greater variety in the ways that we can run Space Elves on the field. And I am very excited about not only new play styles, but seeing a return to a world in which there's just greater diversity and we're running Space Elves with overlapping synergies and buffs, much more so than we are just relying on a blunt instrument, super powerful sub-faction ability that, while it makes sense from a lore perspective, I just don't think encourages the flavor of tactical play that I think make Aeldari, at least for me, one of the most fun factions, probably the most fun faction in the game to run. So this is what I'm hoping for. And if you found this video painfully self-indulgent, but just listen to it because you like my stuff, thanks for hanging with me. I'll be back with something tactically relevant next time. And if you are frustrated that there was a content gap during August, I'm sorry, real life stuff. But I will say that if you became a subscriber and signed up for my Patreon, you could get on Patreon and you would see that there was an interview about Kill Team, which you could listen to. I didn't intend for that to be patron-only content, but it became patron-only content because the audio files are simply not good enough to become a YouTube video. So I'm going to redo a new version of the Aeldari Kill Team video later in the fall when Blades of Cain gets its update. So the one that's on Patreon now will never make it to YouTube, but if you were to support my content for $3 a month, not only could you get access to my Discord, but you could also go check out that content, which theoretically came out a couple weeks ago, but only my patrons heard. A special thank you to my patrons. I hope that those of you who are not patrons will like the video, maybe subscribe, maybe leave a comment. I'm sure many of you have your own ideas about what you would like to see in the Codex. There's really no reason to argue fiercely with me about mine. I have no influence with Games Workshop as far as I'm aware, so it's not like any of this is in danger of becoming real if you don't talk me out of it. But if you have your own ideas about what you'd like to see, please leave those in the comments below. I just get a kick out of talking about this stuff. And that's what I've got. I will be back again soon, I hope, with some tactics-based content, probably a unit-focused video. So if you have something in mind that you'd like to see, feel free to also mention that. Take care, everybody. I will be back soon.